and this session should be sponsored by NetHui, but isn't. And you can follow Ben at Ben Kepes, Kepes, as well on Twitter, and he will be your facilitator for the session. Over to you, Ben.
It's funny that you made the comment about meteorology, because I'll tell a little story. I was helping organise the TEDx conference in Christchurch last year, and Jerry Brownlee was there presenting. And I was introduced to Jerry Brownlee, and the person who was introducing me said, "Oh, this is Ben Kepes. He's a global cloud computing analyst," which is kind of funny in itself. But anyway, and Jerry Brownlee turned around, shook my hand, said, "Oh, nice to meet you. So you work with meteorology, do you?" So that kind of sets the tone for the quality of our elected officials. Anyone that was reading my tweets from this morning will know that I've got some opinions around our elected officials, and it was great that the session after that was all about internet trolls, because there's a few people in this room that have more than once accused me of being a troll. So this is my opportunity to give back and call some other people trolls. We're actually going to talk about cloud computing and business opportunities. I spend a bunch of time talking about cloud computing because I'm actually really excited about it, mainly because it's an enabler. I work primarily in the US, but I live in rural North Canterbury at the end of a 1 meg internet connection, and managed to keep those two seemingly crazy, diametrically opposed things working in sync. The great thing with the cloud is that I just spent 4 or 5 days in the Marlborough Sounds hunting and fishing, and was able to carry on working and doing what I do just because of the cloud. So I work in and I work on the cloud, and that's really exciting. And so that gives us some opportunities back here in New Zealand. You know, we live at the very end of the world. We're a long way from anywhere. Some of those aforementioned trolls in this room are quite keen to sort out some of the problems we have in terms of the connectivity between us and the rest of the world. But regardless of that, we're still a long, long way from anywhere, and it's hard to compete. It's hard for us to compete, and we can only do so much in terms of intensification of dairy. Regardless of what your opinion is around whether dairy is our saviour or not, there's only so much of it we can do. We need to find other ways of doing business. And the great thing with the cloud is, my thesis is that it's a real enabler, that it really levels the playing field, and that we can build businesses in New Zealand on the cloud and in the cloud. And that can mean lots of different things. So we have, obviously, we've all here heard of Xero. We've all seen Rod talk about what they're doing, and so they're building a business which is providing a cloud service, which is software as a service, cloud accounting, to small and medium-sized businesses all around the world. And there's lots of other really good examples that probably don't get as much press. Mike and Paulette here from OneNet, they're doing some great things. So there's a bunch of examples here, but there's also the opportunity to not necessarily build a technology product, but to build, a website, an e-commerce solution. Something that's doing stuff with e-health, or with any of these other opportunities. And what we can do is we can use the cloud to build that business. The word cloud computing is all very exciting because it's one of these sort of hyped terms that you see everyone use. And regardless of what you do, it's called the cloud, because generally companies with 2 or 3 letter abbreviations in their names use the buzzwords to kind of increase their revenue. So I want to put a little bit of context around it so that we're all kind of talking about the same things. What is the cloud? Cloud's kind of actually a really simple concept. In the old days, if you were a business that wanted to have, email, an email server, or a database server, or you wanted to have an application that you hosted, what would you do? You'd probably buy a physical server, a piece of equipment, and stick it in a broom closet somewhere where it got dusty. Fast forward to today, and what do you do when you want to do that stuff? Well, you don't buy a server, because who wants to spend their limited capital? We all know that in New Zealand, capital is really, really limited, so you don't want to spend any of it on stupid technology. What you do is you go out to a cloud computing vendor like Amazon or Rackspace or any one of a number of other vendors, some of them are in New Zealand, and you hire stuff. So the analogy I draw is very much like electricity. In the old days, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, if I wanted to have a joinery factory, I sited it next to a river so that I could use the motive force of the water to turn a water wheel, to turn some pulleys, to turn some belts, to drive some machinery to do my joinery. That was kind of okay, but there's only so many rivers, the water only turns so fast, there's only so much of it. And what if I didn't want to live next to a river? Fast forward to 50 years ago, and if I had a joinery factory, well, I just built a factory, piped in some electricity from the supply authority, flicked on a switch, and it happened. That's great, this utility model. Fast forward again to today, and we're in New Zealand, we're an early adopter of globalisation, so we don't have joinery factories. We send all our trees to China and let China add value to them, and they can make all the added value off our raw materials. But that's a political rant, very outside of the topic of today. So that's some context around cloud computing. What we're trying to talk about here is the opportunities in or on the cloud for New Zealand companies to compete on a global stage. And so really keen to get the thoughts and ideas from everyone and anyone in the room, and obviously out there on the Twitters, talking about where they think the opportunities lie and where the risks and threats lie. So keen to open it up if anyone has some opening thoughts around doing business in or on the cloud from New Zealand to the world. Don't all jump up at once, because there might be sort of kind of stampede herd mentality going on. Oh, excellent, we have a question or a comment or a hand raised anyway. I don't know anything about the cloud, that's fine.
But last year we did look at it. We're a relatively small business with about 5 staff, and we did the number crunching on it, and it was because of the monthly things that you had to pay, it wasn't really worth us going there at this point of time. But I'd be really interested to hear if other people think it would be.
Cool. A little bit of context. Can you just tell us roughly what you do, your organisation?
We're a community development agency on the North Shore, and we have a membership of, we work with community organisations, capacity building, running training, resources, that kind of thing. Cool,
okay. So, good opportunity for, I can obviously espouse on this, but no one wants to hear my voice. Good opportunity for anyone that has, maybe has a corollary to that has started moving stuff to the cloud and can reflect on the economics of what the cloud has meant for them. I'm sure Glenn has something to say. Drop you in it here. What we're talking about is this lady went through the exercise of looking at the economics of moving to the cloud, and found that it turned out to be cost prohibitive because the monthly cost was greater than just buying some kit. And I know you've built. Do you want to? Yeah, we'll just get Glenn to give a little.
So as a startup, not being in the cloud is cost prohibitive. We can run our whole operation on maybe $300 a month. A server on Rackspace is $70 US. Amazon Cloud Storage is under $30 US for what we've got. And then likes of Xero and bug tracking and all that kind of stuff adds up to the rest of the subscription model. So that becomes way cheaper.
So the economics for you are that you simply couldn't afford to do it if it wasn't for the cloud?
Yeah.
Is that?
The other way around, though, if you want to actually host stuff in New Zealand, then that is quite cost prohibitive, because just the $70 US that we pay for a couple of servers is going to be $800. So similar kind of stuff. So
you're a startup. I guess we have a situation here where you've got an organisation that has some existing systems in place. So you've already paid for computers and software.
So on my other hat on of working at realestate.co.nz, we're going through that same thing, and hosting stuff in New Zealand, some stuff is cost prohibitive still at the moment. $1 a gigabyte a month for storage compared to the 18 cents on Amazon makes it cost prohibitive, and we're still buying, our next round, we're still going to be buying hardware in New Zealand for another round of hardware for performance and price reasons.
So, I think you're both right. What I would say is that when we talk about the adoption of cloud, I think of it as this wedge. And there's some stuff that you just simply wouldn't do. You probably wouldn't go out and buy, when you need another email address, you wouldn't go out and buy another server to run a mail server. At that point in time, you're going to move stuff to Gmail or Office 365 or whatever. And it's the sliding wedge. Over time, new stuff will be on the cloud. As your load increases, that stuff will move to the cloud, and over time it'll just gradually ramp up. So I totally agree, and there's a lot of people out there, and a lot of companies out there that are sort of waving this flag saying clouds for everyone, move everything today. Well, that simply isn't the case. It's about fitness for purpose, and everyone's situation is different. Excellent.
My name's Matt. I work for a New Zealand company that's a global cloud, and we look after about 2 million users, and the frontline help desk is 1.5 people. You can get some pretty big economies of scale when you start to operate global clouds, but that's not what I want to talk about. My mother-in-law's law firm is, 15 people, and they came to me and said, we need to buy a new server, and it costs us $10,000. And I said, what else is happening? And they said, we're quite frustrated because sometimes we can't access the server, and we have 2 offices, and we have a phone line going into each office, and sometimes when we call each other, our customers can't reach us. And so they said to me, look, what should we do? And so I took their existing services, their telecommunication services, their IT support, and I took a proposal they had from another provider, and it still took me 20 hours to go through it and figure out what they should do. So it's not as straightforward as I'm just going to move to the cloud. And I work in a cloud company, and I couldn't just say to them, this is what you need to do. It did take me some time to uncover it and pick it apart and figure out what the best step for them was. But after doing all the analysis and what actually turned out that had happened is that they'd merged 2 law firms. They haven't chosen an office manager, and they hadn't given the office manager an IT budget to manage. And so we did all the IT analysis, and it actually came back to solving a business problem, which was they didn't know how much they were spending, and no single person was accountable for spending it, and the partners who were charging themselves out at a relatively healthy profit rate were making the IT decisions. But they couldn't access their calendars at home. They were driving between the office to have meetings, and their customers couldn't reach them. So when you look at IT, it's never about are we using IT because we need to use IT. It's about how can it work in the business environment. And when we actually took another look at the other layer, they weren't backing up their customers' files. So there was a legal liability issue that they didn't even know existed. So I think the simple answer is that moving to the cloud is all well and good, but as you say, it's at the right time and working with the right person and the right provider so they can help you through that transition process. But in my experience, there's always an economic benefit for it, and it happens to be at the right time, at the right place that it needs to occur.
The interesting thing here, and it is probably something reasonably contentious to say, is that it always really annoys me when, and I'm not picking on you for bringing up the economic argument, but it annoys me when people focus on the economics, and I totally understand. I own and run a bunch of businesses, so I know bottom line's really important, and I know that if you've got a proposal, then you need to look at the economics. I know all of that, but if you look at cloud computing as a way to save money, you're kind of missing the point, because what cloud computing does is it enables a bunch of stuff. And so Glenn's example where they could build a business they simply couldn't do if cloud computing didn't exist. The examples where at corporate IT, right, where you want to, say you've got let's give an example, a bank has this project where it wants to build some crazy Facebook application in order to kind of engage its customers or whatever. In the old days, they had to go to corporate IT and requisition some servers and put a business case for getting the capital expenditure to buy this stuff, this equipment. Projects wouldn't get over the line because they couldn't meet that ROI, ratio. Well, nowadays, it's a matter of sort of 10 cents an hour for a server. And so cloud is an enabler, and it allows organisations to be agile and to deliver some results they couldn't before. And that's not so much an economic basis. It's not about reducing the impact of a cost centre. It's about increasing the impact of a profit centre. And I think that's the key thing to try and remember about this stuff. Anyone else? There we go.
Yeah, I just had a question. One, why is hosting so expensive in New Zealand? And the second one, I'm aware of a business that puts its training videos on YouTube. Now that's kind of cloud for free, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, YouTube is the cloud. I mean, again, it comes down to a definitional thing, but when you put videos on YouTube, you have them on a server that isn't in your broom closet, your cleaning cupboard. It's hosted up there somewhere you don't know where it is. So yes, that's the cloud. Why is hosting so expensive in New Zealand? Because we're a country of 4 million people that isn't a particularly early adopter when it comes to technology. You put those two things together and immediately you've got some massive diseconomies of scale. There's no way around that. It's always going to be more expensive for us here. Yes, the price will come down, but it'll always be more expensive. And so you need to decide what is important to actually be here and what doesn't need to be here. And I would suggest that a lot of stuff that people have in New Zealand, because there's this kind of yuck, what happens when the feds come down and, get the New Zealand government to hire helicopters and do crazy, stupid, ridiculous things that make us the laughingstock of the world, but that's another political discussion. When that happens, I would suggest that mega upload happens once in a blue moon, and for every one of those, there's 99 people that are hosting stuff and don't have any issues.
Just a comment that might be of interest to people. In the last 2 years, I've been project managing implementations of New Zealand software in Australia for government agencies from Tasmania, Queensland, and Victoria. One problem we came up against in one of the sites and was to set up a training environment to do the training of the end users using a sample of their subset of their government agency data. And a solution I proposed was to put the application up on the cloud and do the training of that. Quite categorically, in all 3 states, there is no way Australian data, government agency data, is allowed to be outside the Australian geography. Couldn't give me reasons or any debate. It was just a blanket ruling that no, cannot do.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. It was interesting because Marie Schropp, the Privacy Commissioner, was speaking before, and I was at a privacy summit in Wellington a month or two ago where we were talking about, privacy in the age of big data in the cloud. And kind of my point there was that legislation is probably 2 or maybe 3 decades behind technology. And yes, there's all this stuff. In New Zealand's the same. In New Zealand, central government data has to be locally domiciled. Even to the point where there's questions. Admittedly, the questions are kind of grey and it's not a big issue, but there are questions about whether having your financial data in a cloud accounting solution actually complies with the Inland Revenue policies and procedures. I'm not trying to scare, because it is fine, and don't take your data out of any cloud accounting vendor, but there are questions around it. Legislation needs to change very rapidly. People need to lose the kind of slightly immature perspective that anything outside of New Zealand is a risk. But yes, there are some parameters there, and there are some bottom lines. And if you are a company that wants to do stuff with the New Zealand government, you're going to have to find some solution that allows the data to be here. It's just a sad reality. Who's got the mic? Oh, there you go.
One of the interesting things I've found with clouds as they're appearing in New Zealand and appearing in comparison in Australia is that Australia now has some public commercial clouds that are hosted completely in Australia, and government services have been able to start using them, whereas in New Zealand all the clouds that the government is setting up are private clouds that, as far as I know, are entirely only used by government organisations. Which means that they're getting some of the benefits of clouds, like the reliability and the ability to spike traffic, but you're not getting the ability to offset your traffic costs and general cloud infrastructure costs against the different kind of spikes in usage that happen for private enterprise. Private enterprise often peaks around Christmas time and things like that. I know that the Amazon cloud was originally built to handle that, whereas I imagine the peak usage for government stuff is more like around inland revenue, tax year end kind of time. So I don't know where that discussion needs to go, but I'd be interested to see if there is a possibility in the future that some of those private clouds can stop actually needing to be large private clouds and can start crossing over into being provided to the public as well to offset some of those costs.
You raise a massively, massively good point. And the interesting thing around the workload for IRD is the IRD isn't actually on that private cloud. The IRD is sitting on some horrible old mainframe stuff because the IRD is kind of precious about its data, but that's an aside. You're right. There are several vendors in Australia doing cloud stuff in Australia, Ninefold, Cloud Central, a few others. And as well as that, it's no real secret that at least two of the major vendors, Amazon and Rackspace, will be in Australia before the end of the year. Little old New Zealand, we've spent 3 years with the government negotiating this preferred private cloud contract with a few different vendors. But where does it, we've got, Stephen Joyce was here this morning, and I'm not anti-national, whoever the Minister of IT is of the day starts sitting here talking about innovation, how we need to innovate, and the lifeblood of this country is innovative young companies. But then what happens? They spend all this sweat and blood sorting out their own private cloud for central government data, and central government data is generally a drain on innovation, let's be honest. But what actually happens to the opportunities for the startups? And you're dead right. And there's no logical answer, unfortunately. Lance might have one.
I see mods over there from TradeMe. Give them the indication. Is there a demand for someone like TradeMe to say, let's create a New Zealand-based cloud-hosted solution, an AWS Lite perhaps? No.
Yep.
Anyone? Do we?
There absolutely is. Glenn, you've talked about your costs and your costs of data in New Zealand. And if there was an opportunity for you to get some space with TradeMe, what would the answer be?
Yeah, our arch competitor.
Yeah, bad example.
No. But good friend.
Co-opetition.
For sure. I mean, we so at realestate.co.nz, 80% of our traffic is onshore. We have to host in New Zealand because we need that for the speed. We do want to go cloud, and if there was a more affordable solution, we would definitely go for it. And I think there's probably lots of companies who would host in New Zealand who are targeting New Zealand companies.
Okay, so Nat said there were no deliverables out of today, but here's a deliverable as a challenge to TradeMe as a local company that's obviously local company in inverted commas that's done awesome things for itself and for the country. What is there a business case there to do something like that? We need a mic over here if possible. That wasn't a rhetorical question.
First thing I'd say, I'm so not the cable guy to have this conversation with in a useful, that wasn't code, Lance, in a useful way. But a couple of things. Firstly, for us, the integrity of our customers' data is really, really important, and the ability to harness our data to provide a safe and secure and trusted marketplace is really important. For that reason, we're unlikely to be big cloud users ourselves. We'd rather keep control of it and know the bounds of it and be able to both do a good job of protecting it but also harnessing it. So it's probably not going to be something we're going to leap into. But what we have done, because there have been more people who are pretty frustrated with how much they have to pay for good local storage, is really on a come and sit with us and have a cup of tea is putting people on our network. So we've had 3 reasonably, great New Zealand companies as far as we're concerned, come to us and talk about that, which has been interesting for us because it isn't really a business we've ever looked at, but kind of recognise the need.
It's interesting because as a bit of context and a bit of background, there's no argument as to which is the biggest cloud infrastructure player in the world. It's Amazon Web Services. What is Amazon Web Services? Amazon Web Services takes the smarts and technology that was developed through hosting Amazon.com, the biggest online bookstore, or the biggest online everything store in the world, and sells that to other people. So not at all dissimilar to TradeMe. TradeMe has the bulk of New Zealand traffic, has some great smarts at delivering solutions locally to customers. And so in terms of your comment about it's not where at or whatever, interesting parallels there. And I just wonder how the business case would work out if you were to do some kind of public cloud offering, not TradeMe consumer cloud, but TradeMe delivering cloud, selling cloud to New Zealand companies. I'd suggest that there's actually a pretty good opportunity there. Cool.
Hi, Joel Falling.
That could be an awesome delivery.
I'm using my me hat with some experience from my other hat. So I think I disagree with you. I think there's actually a real
With who?
disadvantage.
Everyone here or just me?
Just you. Just you.
That's okay.
On your comment to do with not being precious about where the stuff's hosted, I actually fundamentally think it's incredibly important about where the stuff's hosted. For example, I've been pushing. I mean, I like virtualization and scalable server management, which is what we're actually talking about. Not plus some APIs. I mean, it's really not rocket science. I think we use this cloud term a little bit too much. Anyway, I've been really behind that, pushing it in the telco environment, which is very toxic to it up until recently, and getting sectors which have traditionally not been happy having their data in places they're not sure of has been hard. But to do that, we need to have localized data centers. And the conversation that's going on down there, I mean, continue that conversation, please, because...
So can you clarify why it's such a risk, me having my...
Do you want the network to go down again because it's hosted in Bangalore and we can't get to the element management system?
With the greatest respect, and it's awesome that we're having this dissent because that's what makes conversation. But with the greatest respect, bringing on some sort of fear, uncertainty and doubt about, your stuff in Bangalore doesn't really cut it. I mean, I have my documents on Google servers. They're available much more readily than if I had them on Microsoft Office sitting on a machine.
Sure,
somewhere.
but you're talking about very layer 7 stuff, and I'm talking about the thing that runs the network underneath being hosted overseas. So we're talking about a network management system being hosted in the cloud. That needs to be in New Zealand. I'm sorry, I need to be able to know where that is, and I need to know that the international pipe, when it gets severed because there's an earthquake or tsunami, is not going to prevent me from getting access to it. And there's a lot of industry.
I would suggest there's a lot more. I live in Christchurch. I've come through the earthquakes. I would suggest there's a lot more risk if we're talking about earthquake or tsunami to having data localized than having it internationally. But can we? Yeah, Paul.
Hi Ben, Paul Quickenden. So look, I view cloud for New Zealand in two contexts. Business in New Zealand needs to start getting to grips with cloud computing, because if we don't, then the same kind of bias we're seeing with manufacturing shifting to low-cost places will happen, and you will find yourself priced out of the market. And that's a small part of the equation. For me, I think New Zealand really needs to get to grips with the fact that now that we have an opportunity to sell to a market of 4 billion people, not 4 million people, and if you carve out a niche in there, it might be a $5 billion market. And we are starting to see the evolution of those, and you've talked about a few companies. Bend is another one that springs to mind, starting to crack certain markets. But that's the true opportunity for New Zealand business, because as you said, exporting more cows or milk products is not, infinitely scalable. The thing about the internet is cloud computing can be. We haven't reached the boundaries yet.
Sure.
Just going back to the previous point, sorry to just intervene there, but the case about where you put your data offshore, onshore, is a case of risk management. You need to do a risk assessment. If it's risk based, and that's really what that's been the government's approach. They're very conservative when it comes to risk. That's why they are taking the position they are. Over time, my personal view, clearly not as a public servant, but over time they will become being able to, I won't say less risk averse, but being able to manage their risks better and more confidently, which will allow them to be a little more innovative than they appear to be today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and governments obviously are in a different situation, but I'm interested by the appetite or lack thereof of us as individual consumers for our data to be domiciled out of New Zealand, because I would suggest that way more is out of New Zealand than is in New Zealand. Go ahead, microphone. Oh, sorry. Yep.
I was just going to talk about the risk management sort of thing. I work for Radio New Zealand. I run the website. We're a lifeline utility, so we have to manage risk very carefully, because it's mandated that we have to keep going, in the event of some kind of emergency. And our hosting agreement running out in August, and we had to think, are we going to go into the cloud, or do we need a lot more control over what we're going to do? And we went for the control because, of course, latency is important to us, so we want to host locally. but the cost of cloud services in New Zealand is too much because we want to burst the line rate. We want to burst to gigabit. When the daytime earthquake happened in Christchurch, we were doing 50 times the normal amount of traffic, 2 minutes after the quake.
Yep.
And actually, allowing for that capacity in advance is obviously very expensive. So I think every business has to actually write down, what freedoms do they want to retain, what is their risk profile, and then, make decisions on that basis.
Yeah, and that's, we'll swap the microphone here because otherwise you're going to have a hernia. And it comes down to that sliding wedge and fitness for purpose, and everyone's situation is different and all those sorts of things. Totally agree.
Thanks. So I work for the startup that Time Forgot. And just about network management system. So I help write a network management system that does run in the cloud. So that there's a way to do that. The other thing is in terms of like making sure your network is really reliable and can handle those kind of bursts. So between, it's now public knowledge, we use SDN to connect our data sets together. We routinely run links at 100%. And we can do that because we have software that can say exactly what's there and what's not. And there is a lot of open source work going on about this, and I'm actually doing this open source work in New Zealand. So yes, I mean obviously there's a risk equation, you've got to look at it, everybody's needs are different, everything else, but there may be more options in there than you think.
Yeah, I agree. The technical barriers maybe aren't so much of a barrier, and in terms of the risk equation, there's a counter risk equation that people need to think of as well. I mean, we need to, Lance, with a bit of an ulterior motive, pointed out there was a comment on Twitter about where your traffic comes from, and that absolutely is an issue. I mean, there was a tweet this morning from Rod, who was watching the live stream of NetHui at home and said it's great that the fibre that he's got at his home in Napier, he can watch NetStream and it's the NetHui stream and it's beautiful, but the problem is our content comes from elsewhere and we've only got one pipe between us and elsewhere, arguably. So how much of that is an issue, and don't want to get into the pros and cons of Pacific Fibre versus SX because that's a whole can of worms, but how much of that is an issue, and are there similar kind of technical solutions around that don't require a massively expensive capital project to be undergone? Anyone got any thoughts on that? That preferably isn't Lance, because he's a little bit biased. With the greatest respect, Lance. Anyone? No? Oh. Yeah.
I don't see any technical barriers to having our content offshore. I know that the pipes are clogged, but they're clogged for commercial reasons, not for technical reasons. Latency is spoken about quite a lot. There are fixes to TCP that can be implemented. And data centers, Amazon, for example, is opening up in Sydney. That is going to solve some major cloud problems for New Zealand. Sydney is about the same latency as an average DSL line. So if you're on a fiber connection in New Zealand, you're not really going to have any problem using a cloud-hosted high bandwidth service in Sydney.
So it's a business issue, it's not a technical issue?
It is entirely a business issue, not a technical issue at all.
Absolutely. Cool. It's behind you. Yep.
Yeah, the comment I was going to make isn't about that, which is why I sort of passed it on. And it's to an extent, I think it's possibly been addressed in some of the discussion about risk management and that sort of thing. But my question, coming from an utterly inexpert point of view, is about data persistence and the sort of, the security. I mean, if you're hosting locally, there is this idea that you can back it up twice, 3 times, you can offsite backup, you can do all these sorts of things. There seems to be a feeling that if it's in the cloud, it's protected in some ways. Now, that there are plenty of organisations that are preventing that and are providing their own risk management services for that. But we've seen that there are any number of reasons why data can disappear, whether a company gets sold and suddenly that's no longer a concern, whether the servers get seized by somebody like the FBI, whether, there are all manner of reasons why suddenly data is no longer available. And when it comes to business in the cloud, that's obviously a much more serious question to be raised.
You're right, and it's nice that you worded that in a non-confrontational way, because often that's worded in a confrontational way, to which the answer is yes, but do you print out every single email you get just in case your email system goes down and you lose it? But because you worded it nicely and non-confrontationally, There's absolutely some issues there. I mean, there's been some recent outages. Amazon Web Services has had a couple of outages recently. The last one was last week, and it took down Netflix, which, if you know how much the US loves streaming video, that's a disaster of the highest magnitude, in the US anyway. So, yeah, there's some issues there, and those are actually technical issues. Those are around, as a vendor, as a software provider, technology provider, you need to plan for failure. You need to have redundancy in place. You need to have failover mechanisms. And I've spent a lot of time with the chief architect at Netflix, who's an amazing guy. And Netflix have something called the Chaos Monkey. You can tell they're geeks because that's the sort of term that really excites geeks. But basically, the Chaos Monkey is this amazing automated system that runs all these tests on Netflix to do this crazy loading, simulating outages, doing all the stuff to basically break Netflix in order to make it better so that it doesn't break. As a business in New Zealand that isn't a technology business, you're not expected to do that, but you are expecting that your provider does that sort of stuff. And so one of the reasons, to use the Xero example again, one of the reasons that Xero raised $30 million in their IPO or whatever was because they determined that to have a credible, reliable service, they needed to invest in some really smart people, some really smart technology in order to build the systems that are fail-safe. Now, I would say, as an aside, that the systems are getting a lot better, and more you're able to abstract the technical smarts in order to make something really fail-safe away from yourself, and the provider can provide that for you. But you need to think, there's stuff that the customer needs to think about for sure, and you raise a really good point on that topic.
I just wanted to say that one of the times that I think it was Amazon came down, many of the companies only had a single cloud solution in the United States. This was brought about by a denial of service attack. This was not brought about by smarts or anything like that inside their organization. And one of the few organizations that actually survived seamlessly was IBM, who had dual support or dual clouds running. And so it's not just running a single cloud, they were on completely different networks that could roll over on top of each other. And this was an overt attack that was going on. Secondly, I would again harp on that looking for new technology in terms of the way to distribute data efficiently within New Zealand. We should be looking at multi-point to multi-point multicast. Thank you.
So just a point of clarification, the recent outage, which was last week with Amazon, wasn't a denial of service, it was a power outage on their East Coast data centres. Amazon as a cloud provider, and I don't care less about Amazon, but I'm using them as an example, have multiple availability zones in APAC, EU, US East and West Coast. The problem comes when customers that are using cloud computing providers don't think about planning for that. They go with, right, we're going to put all our stuff on Amazon West Coast because it's just easier than having to think about balancing West and East Coast. And then all of a sudden the West Coast goes down because something crazy like, God forbid, an earthquake happens and they're down. So, that's a technical issue. It's not a technical issue with the vendor because Amazon does provide the building blocks, but it's like using Lego. At the end of the day, if you can't build a Lego set, is that Lego's problem? Well, it's probably not. Maybe it's not a good analogy, but anyway, it's the best I've got. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Marie? The big bad privacy issues.
Well, I just wanted to add a brief postscript. I mean, the discussion's obviously about business risks and so forth, but I mean, you do have to think about your customer as well. And some of the risks that we've identified, and many other regulators overseas have identified, include things like, customers being reassured that their data is secure and that it's not going to be accessed inappropriately and that it's not going to be sold and passed on and all of that kind of thing. So, I don't want to be a bore about risks, but that's part of being in business in a responsible way, and also in keeping your customers. So, the mega upload situation is a wonderful example of where, suddenly it's not pirated films, it's actually people's photos and business records and things like that. So, I think part of being in business in a responsible way will be catering for all of those risks and thinking about your customer as well. And short commercial, we shortly expect to produce short guidelines for businesses aimed mostly at small businesses and people who are going to buy cloud services as to the sort of checklist they should go through before they buy those cloud services. And just finally, I wanted to mention that I gave a speech in Wellington on Monday, and several of the business, this was a business audience, several of the businesses there that they have cloud providers telling them there is no risk in the cloud, no risks at all. So, you know, if anybody here is doing that, please don't.
So I think, I mean, first I've got to say thanks for all the work that you and the Commission does, because, you know, we all of us in New Zealand owe a debt of gratitude to you for looking out for us. With that said, I would suggest that, you know, how many people here aren't on Facebook? Right, not many. The overwhelming majority are. We all get a high degree of utility one way or another out of being on Facebook, or, you know, using Google as our search engine. We also realise, you know, there's no secrets that Google mines our data to provide, you know, commercial results for themselves. Facebook mines our data. We're prepared to take that risk, or not even take that risk, to take that flip side of being online, because the benefits that we achieve are better because of them. So too with your comments. Now, I've seen the draft privacy cloud document, and I think it's a really great attempt at putting some stuff in place. And I absolutely commend anyone doing anything to educate businesses and organisations and individuals in New Zealand about the risks, because that's really important. But the reality is, we're New Zealand, we're 4 million people. Google, to use an example, is a company that sells to whatever the global population is, but it's lots of zeros more than 4 million. We can't achieve anything on the global scale. No one cares what we say. And so the reality is that we have a choice to make, for sure. We can use the cloud and gain the benefits the cloud brings us, or we can choose to opt out, and that's fine. We opted out once before, and, you know, Muldoon went down that road, and it arguably didn't get us to a great place, but that's the choice we have. I don't think we have much of a choice around advocating for a changing approach from vendors, because I don't believe that's realistic given, you know, the size of our economy and the influence that we have. Any thoughts? What I'm keen to, in the last sort of few minutes, is sort of talk about the opportunities. You know, Paul talked about it before, the opportunities for New Zealand businesses to go global, because we've talked about, hey, we're a New Zealand business that, you know, needs to host some data, and we need a data centre here, and yeah, that's important, and absolutely I think Trade Me should really look at both from a public good perspective but also from a business perspective. There could be some stuff done there, but maybe more exciting in terms of removing our reliance on you know, grass being turned into milk, is how can we build global businesses from here in New Zealand? Clearly, you know, Xero is kind of held up as the poster child, but there's some amazing businesses that are being built on the cloud to a greater or lesser extent in New Zealand. We've got Orion Health, which is probably the most successful technology business in New Zealand that no one has ever heard of. You know, obviously Yike Bike's got a lot of attention. We've got, you know, a company up here in Auckland called Vend, which is doing incredible stuff with cloud-based point of sale, and an unbelievable company literally out of well, it wasn't someone's garage, it was someone's spare room. We've got a global business that absolutely is taking on the best in the world, and I'm sure it's going to be acquired very soon for huge amounts of money and make a lot of people, some of whom are in this room, slightly rich. What are the opportunities here for New Zealand companies to take our smarts, take some infrastructure and some tools from overseas and to go global? That's the exciting thing. Keen to hear any thoughts that people have around those opportunities. Mike, you've normally got an opinion on this. Give that man a mic. Give Mike a mic. Just thought I'd slip that in there.
I was keeping my head low because I'm a cloud vendor. I see an absolutely incredible potential. Supercomputing with a credit card. When I finished my PhD work 30 years ago, I had every intention of developing a commercial product. It was impossible. Computing costs were so high. The ability to distribute intellectual property around the world was almost zero without capital. So it means that anybody, as Ben said, in a spare room in the house can start writing some code at night and invent a new business model, disrupt an existing business. We see the whole commercial landscape littered with organisations that have failed because they haven't seen the disruptive innovation coming along that's been enabled by technology. And as you probably know, Kurtzwell has made this comment many times that humans have a great deal of difficulty understanding exponential curves. They see the world going in a straight line, but they don't see how that doubling and doubling and doubling in 4 or 5 years' time, suddenly we have 4, 10, 8, 20 times the computing power. That's the kind of enabler that we get. If you could run your dairy cows that way, we would be very rich, but it's not the way it's going to work. And that's why technology has an incredible ability. Now, we built a global software company in the 90s. I know that there are lots of very, very capable young New Zealanders who can write world-class code. And it's an enabler to get that kind of capability out into the world, the waitlist economy, all the things you've heard about. It is a real opportunity for us to grow as a nation. And I think we should encourage anybody who's doing that, because you can enter the market so easily and so quickly. You know, in the 1990s, you had to raise a huge amount of capital to buy web servers. Venture capitalists will not give you any money to buy any computing capability. They expect you to get it off the cloud. And that's the enabler that we've all been talking about. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. I mean, absolutely. Like I do a lot of work, doing advisory work and stuff with startups here in New Zealand, and it's amazing how a couple of guys sitting in a spare room or two can use these tools to build some amazing stuff. And the really interesting thing for us, I mean, I spend a lot of time in the US. I'm in the US at least once a month. And the amazing thing is, you know, before I started going to the US, I came down here and I didn't really know where on the map Silicon Valley was. So that was my awareness of how this industry works. And then I had a trip to go to San Francisco, so I quickly found out where Silicon Valley was. So I didn't look really stupid. It's okay, because in America no one knows anything about geography, so it doesn't really matter. But before I went up to the US, I always had this perception that, man, those guys can do amazing things. You know, like Google was, you know, Sergey and Larry and Stanford, and it just happened. And, you know, Facebook was Mark dropping out of university and those sorts of things. And we've got people that are just as smart. We've got people that come up with solutions that are just as competitive. They don't lack the technical smarts. There's not really an issue in terms of capital. I mean, everyone talks about the fact that we need, you know, venture funding in New Zealand and all these sorts of things. There's not an issue in terms of capital. The biggest issue is just, frankly, having the balls to, no offence to the ladies, having the balls to just go and do it. And I see who's been successful here in New Zealand. It's people like Vaughan from Vend, who, you know, backed himself, sat in his room for a year before he got any funding, because he had a passion and he had a vision that building a cloud-based point of sale was going to work. And what does he do now? You know, he's got a bunch of funding, but he's up in the US every month, going around the VCs, doing the partnerships, doing the deals. That's all it takes. It's not actually that hard. It's just a case of getting on a plane.
As someone who's sponsoring Vaughan's jaunts across to America, the biggest thing that Vend faces actually is salespeople. You know, you can't just throw something up into the cloud. I think we all know this. You can't just throw something up into the cloud or wherever, in the App Store, and expect it to sell. You've actually got to get out there and sell it. And you know, I struggle with this cloud thing. It's a solution in search of a problem sometimes, or it's just a word. But you know, it's just one of those things which is, we should take it for granted now. We should talk about where the data resides. We should accept that it's the way of doing business in the future. We should help companies that are relying on incumbent old systems to flip up. But ultimately, you know, it's just one of those things that's there, and we should be focusing on all the other stuff as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and I think you know, I spend my days and nights talking about the cloud, but really I talk about the cloud with a big C, and to me the cloud is an enabler, and it just happens to deliver a lot of the stuff that was hard before, but really it's tying together a bunch of things, and it's allowing companies like Vend to get to the point where they battle up against the issues around, you know, finding good salespeople or finding the right partnerships or whatever. It's about having a holistic approach towards business, and I guess where I disagree with you, Lance, is that when you say that, you know, cloud is overused and whatever, what I'd say is that the chances are that Venn could have never got to the point of having an issue with salespeople or lack of salespeople before the cloud. And that's why cloud is such a big thing, because it allows people to get to that point more readily. We can argue about that, I guess, but that's my perspective. Anyone have any thoughts? We've got one over here. Yep. Good work to the microphone girls as well. Thanks, guys. That's awesome.
Might New Zealand conceptually have an opportunity in the international hosting of cloud?
It was really interesting. I presented at the Cairns Summit last year. Cairns is this broadband symposium between the South Korean, Australian and New Zealand governments. And at that time we were talking about, if and when Pacific Fibre happens, which was just a rudimentary idea back then, it was a couple of years ago, maybe pitching to get rid of Tiwai Point because aluminium isn't that exciting, building a big data centre there using the power that from Manapuri that powers Tiwai Point, and pitching as kind of a global cloud computing provider. The reality is, I'm not sure whether that stacks up. Have we got any real point of difference? I mean, yes, we've got clean-ish power, we've got reasonably cheap power, but our regulatory framework is probably such that it's difficult.
There's some of the strategic benefits we may not be really considering are our political stability, our relationship as being a broker in the Western world, which is, in a sense, what's happening with the TPP. And we have a legal process, putting Mr. Dotcom aside, which has some respect. We have some things going for us which perhaps we're not factoring in.
So, Lance, are we going to have Pacific Cloud?
So I've got a few hats that are salient here. I'm part owner of a power company, worked in aluminium before, and working with Glenn and some cloud stuff, and also a non-active founder of Pacific Fibre. I agree, the laws in New Zealand should be the best in the world. Our data integrity, our data security, the way we look after people should be the best in the world. The .com thing has ruined that for now. And we've got to fix it. There's no question in my mind. The other problem is Manapuri is a really crazy idea. It's far too far away from your connections to the country, which are always going to come through the top of the North Island, because we're basically point to America, right? And so your latency, you want to minimise your latency, so you need to be, Hamilton and North, something like that. So the idea of a geothermal power station powering a bunch of data centres, I think, has some merit. The big boys aren't really going to look at this stuff until you've got multiple suppliers of international connectivity, right? Which a bunch of folks are working on. So I think that's, I think there's something there. I think we all desperately want it to happen, but where did Amazon just set up? They set up in Sydney. And
I guess the thing I'm trying to say is maybe there's another leap forwards if we were bold enough, which relates to connectivity and relates to the way, instead of having to export to the world, we can fit in differently.
I think the answer
that's a mindset issue.
Potentially, yes, but it's getting over a lot of hurdles to get to that point.
Yeah, we are on the edge. We're not in the middle. We're not a crossroads. So Singapore is a crossroads of international trade, and they built themselves in the back of that. We're not. We're just in that geographically wrong place. It's awesome to be so isolated, and it's also, moments like these are what we struggle with. Maybe that's an asset. Yeah, it is an asset that we can, I think, is a repository of data, not necessarily an active one. There could be some benefits there, sure.
So, folks, we're out of time. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions. It's been great. And you can send a message to Modster asking for Trade Me to set up a local cloud service here in New Zealand. Thanks, everyone.
So, you made a sterling effort to make your point by crossing the room. Lesson to the politicians that you can cross the floor and still make a good contribution. Well done. And for introducing us to the idea that it's not just IT, there are business solutions and also lawyers as Luddites. Kudos to that. So just a quick changeover for this room, and we'll be carrying on here with taking advantage of the UFB. Otherwise, into your next session, please. Thank you.